It's no secret we have a rental crisis here in British Columbia, and I am a firm believer that the government caused this rental housing crisis. Welcome back to the Manning Up on Real Estate podcast. This is Manning Up After Dark, and in this episode, I'm going to break down why I feel the government has actually created the rental housing crisis and the blame is on the landlords when it shouldn't be. I've got 3 points we're going to make here in this video that's going to help you understand why I think the landlords are not to blame. First and foremost is we're going to talk about government interference in free markets. Why governments shouldn't be sticking their hands in a free market, and when they start to regulate things, it can actually make things worse. Secondly, we're going to talk about why alienating landlords is probably not the best thing to do, and why most of the landlords are not large institutional landlords that you should be alienating. And lastly would be the correlation on supply versus demand in this province when you add the first two together and mix it with government policies when it comes to immigration. So let's dive in and talk about it. So the first one, interfering in the free market. Well, at the end of the day, there's several things the government has done. There's actually too much to name when it comes to interfering in a free market, but I'm going to cover a couple of main points when it comes to this one. First, we used to have fixed term leases here in British Columbia. That has changed and all of our leases roll into month to month. Now, we recently had Keaton Bessie, who is a property manager, speak about this at our investors performance group meeting, and I will link that one in the notes right above me right here. So you can go back and check that out, check out his talk. But what he talked about here, and I totally agree with, is that when fixed terms used to end, it allowed for landlords to basically give the option that the tenant would either have to move out or agree to a new rental amount. This is where the government decided to step in and say, well, that's not fair. We're going to close this loophole and not allow landlords to be able to end the term. And basically, all rents now roll over, or all leases will roll over onto month to month. But here's the thing, when you have free markets, like using Alberta as an example, if a lease is about to end, the tenant has a choice. They can either one, agree to re-rent it at current market rents, or two, they can choose to leave. Now, what typically will happen is when they're getting close to the end of their lease, they're going to start looking around and they're going to see what everyone else is charging for rents. So they have the determination that if rents are on the rise and they can negotiate with the landlord to maybe get a slight, discount because they've been there before, maybe they'll sign a new lease and stay with that landlord and stay in the property. Or if they've noticed that the market, because again, the market determines the rental, they notice that those rents are down, well, they have the choice to either one, move and get cheaper rent elsewhere, or two, they can maybe negotiate with the landlord saying, hey, I am going to leave. You're going to have to find a new tenant. And guess what? Here's what we're finding in the leases, in the rents. That's where suddenly, if we start to put our hands into what the free market does, we start restricting that. And that's why suddenly landlords every single year are just going to opt to raise the rents in British Columbia. Now, obviously, that brings up the next point is that the government has regulated here in BC how much you can raise the rent. It's not based on what's going on in the market. It's not going on what's happening with inflation. They're saying 3.5%. At the time, inflation was significantly above that. They cap it so that you can't raise it. Now, they're dealing with increases in insurance. If it's a strata, increase in strata fees. So suddenly properties are no longer making sense because we're not able to raise the rents enough for what the expenses are that we have garnered over that year. Now, I know the tenants are going to say, well, that's the risk of being a landlord. But at the same token, landlords aren't getting into this business for charity. So if they're suddenly having to supplement the rent because they're not covering the expenses, the next logical thing they're going to do is sell that property and get out of it. Because who wants to carry a property where they're basically subsidizing the tenant? Not a lot of landlords can do that, in fact, because we're going to get into the next part with alienating landlords, but most of them cannot afford that. So here's the thing, as you continue to interfere with the free market, you're going to create issues where landlords are going to start to want to look for more favorable locations. So that brings me into point number two, which is alienating landlords. We have seen it non-stop, the constant media attacking landlords, this, bad landlords, that. And well, like any industry, there's going to be good landlords and there's going to be bad landlords. No different than there's good police officers and bad police officers. There's good lawyers and bad lawyers. There's good doctors and bad doctors. There's good Starbucks employees and there's bad Starbucks employees. At the end of the day, there's always going to be some people that are going to paint the industry with a bad light. And what happens is we use those bad examples as a reason why we should basically make blanket changes across the board when it comes to policy. Well, that's not the right thing to do because all you're doing is alienating the good landlords who are providing clean and nice rental housing. You start increasing taxes on them. You start putting restrictions on them, like we talked about interfering in the free market. The more you start putting on these landlords, the more they're going to want to walk away and find more favorable areas for their investment dollars. In fact, here's a very important thing that I think we should consider is that most landlords are not large corporations. Most of them in BC are small mom and pop landlords. Now, there are large institutional landlords, and I think by alienating the small mom and pops, we're actually opening the door for large corporations to come in and get more market share. But when you alienate these small mom and pops, they're there because they've raised their kids in the home, they've grown up in that property, and now they're either downsizing or maybe they're moving away or whatever the case is. And in Canada, we don't have a lot of options when it comes to really building up a good retirement. Let's be realistic here. One of the things that you can do is obviously invest in real estate to help build a bit of a nest egg. Most investors out there are just owning maybe one extra property, and that one extra property is what they're banking on to hopefully go up in value, generate some income, and help them retire comfortably. But instead, we have demonized that. We have made them out to be the bad guy. When we create all these rent controls and they're working hard, living in their property, paying their expenses, and now they're subsidizing rents for tenants, well, what ends up happening is they have to liquidate that property. Suddenly, that property is now no longer available in the rental pool. That tenant is now going into the pool, looking amongst properties where there's already low vacancy across the board. In fact, in most areas of BC, the vacancy is less than 1%. We are in a rental crisis and it is caused by the government. So alienating these small mom and pop investors is actually opening the door for large institutional investors, which is exactly what the government's trying to avoid, right? You're basically saying that all these mom and pops are not going to be able to invest here. So they're going to take their properties, they're going to sell them, they're going to move their investment dollars elsewhere. Maybe they're putting it into the stock market, maybe it's into mutual funds, maybe they're buying properties in other provinces, or maybe even down to the States or other countries. So these large institutional investors are recognizing that we have a rental crisis and they're able to move in because they have huge buying power. They're able to buy up large blocks of properties and, of course, profit off of them because they have the backing of large amounts of money. The small mom and pops don't. So they are able to take advantage of rental crises caused by the government, which is exactly what they're trying to avoid is the big bad landlord. So when we boil it all down, going into point number 3, supply versus demand. At the end of the day, as we continue to alienate and we continue to interfere with the free market, we're going to have less properties available for rent. It's just a matter of fact. More and more landlords, as I mentioned, are going to sell. They're going to move to other areas. They're going to invest their dollars where it's landlord friendly. And when we do that and we continue to have policies that increase our population, and let's be realistic, the federal government has been very aggressive on their immigration plans. Well, that's going to put pressure on an already pressured system. We're going to see more people looking for rentals and more people are getting out of the rental market. As a realtor who does work with a lot of investors, I have been selling a lot of tenant occupied properties, which means that those tenants are being evicted because they're end user buyers who are buying these properties, which means that property is now no longer available for rent. And those tenants are now competing for all the other eyes. Now, if you're sitting there watching this and you're saying, well, Cameron, at the end of the day, there's reports showing that the rents have actually come down 9.1%. Well, you need to go back and again, watch that video. I'm going to link it somewhere right here that talks about the fallacy of these rental numbers here in British Columbia. Keaton does a great job on using the fact and data that in British Columbia, rents here are private. Unlike markets like Toronto, where MLS is used heavily for rental properties and can create trackable data on what things are actually renting for, in BC, because it's mostly mom and pop, or if it is being with a property manager or an institution, it's going through their private websites or places like Facebook Marketplace. These companies like rentals.ca and Zumper are just using algorithms to pull across ads to try to determine where the rents are. They're not actualized rents. The other problem with that is that if you look across these multiple platforms and what they're reporting, they're not consistent. So it shows that they're pulling data from multiple different sources. Zumper saying around a 5% decrease, rentals.ca is saying about a 9.1. So if you're sitting there and trying to argue the fact that rents have come down, well, we got to look at the fact that rents were on the rise significantly over time. It's just simple knowledge versus the fact that, yeah, they might be down a little bit because we've had some changes in what's happening in our government, but that's not going to last long. As long as you continue to alienate and interfere with the free market, you're going to have more and more landlords leave this area. And if you're going to have continued immigration bringing more and more people in, we are going to continue to have a rental crisis. And that's exactly why I believe the government has created the rental housing crisis in British Columbia. Now, I'm curious what your thoughts are. If you agree with me or disagree, I would like to hear from you. Drop it in the comments on this podcast, whether you're listening on Spotify or watching it here on YouTube. And I would love to have a conversation or even a potential debate with you on what has actually caused the rental housing crisis in your mind in British Columbia.